Every leader faces impossible decisions, but few have to write goodbye letters to 12 families before dawn. Jack McLeod's final night at Gallipoli would test everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. It was August 6, 1915, when Sergeant Jack "Jacko" McLeod received the orders that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The piece of paper was simple enough, just a few lines scrawled in Lieutenant Harrison's nervous handwriting. But those words would seal the fate of 12 good men and force Jack to confront the terrible mathematics of war. "Sergeant McLeod," the young lieutenant had said, his voice barely steady, "your squad is to take Hill 60 at first light. Intelligence suggests minimal Turkish resistance. Should be straightforward." Jack had looked at the hill through his field glasses. Even in the fading light, he could see the Turkish positions, the carefully placed machine gun nests, the impossible terrain they'd have to cross. This wasn't going to be straightforward. This was going to be a slaughter, but what Jack didn't know was that Lieutenant Harrison had received different intelligence. Intelligence that would reveal the true cost of the orders he'd just given. Jack McLeod wasn't like the other sergeants. At 28, he was older than most, a former dock worker from Sydney who'd joined up not for glory or adventure, but for one simple reason. His younger brother Tommy had enlisted, and Jack couldn't let the boy face this war alone. He'd been a union organizer back home, used to fighting for working men's rights, used to standing up to bosses who treated people like numbers on a ledger. But here at Gallipoli, he was the one giving orders that would send men to their deaths. The irony wasn't lost on him. His squad trusted him completely. 12 men from all corners of Australia, farmers, clerks, miners, shop boys, who'd followed him through 3 months of hell because they believed he'd bring them home alive. And now he had to lead them into an attack he knew they couldn't survive. As Jack sat in his dugout that night, staring at the blank sheets of paper before him, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to write letters, not to his own family, but to theirs. The first letter was to Mrs. Patricia Collins in Melbourne. Her son Danny was just 19, barely old enough to shave, but he'd volunteered to carry the squad's radio because it was the most dangerous job and he didn't want anyone else to risk it. "Dear Mrs. Collins," Jack began, his hand trembling slightly, "by the time you read this, your Danny will be gone. I want you to know that he died doing something brave, something that mattered. He died protecting his mates." But as Jack wrote those words, he wondered if they were true. Would Danny's death matter? Would any of their deaths matter if they were just following orders that everyone knew were suicide? The second letter was to Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien in Perth. Their son Michael had been a teacher before the war, always talking about the books he'd read, the places he wanted to see when this was all over. He'd shown Jack a photograph of the girl he planned to marry, a sweet-faced young woman named Catherine who wrote him letters every week. But as Jack wrote Michael's letter, he discovered something that would make his impossible task even harder. Hidden in Michael's kit, Jack found a letter the young man had been writing to Catherine. It was unfinished, dated that very day, and it revealed something that made Jack's heart sink. "My dearest Catherine," Michael had written, "I can't tell you how scared I am. Not of dying, I've made my peace with that, but I'm scared of letting the other lads down. Sergeant McLeod is the finest man I've ever known, and if he says we need to take that hill, then we'll take it. I just hope I'm brave enough when the time comes." Jack set the letter down, his vision blurring. Michael wasn't just following orders, he was following Jack. They all were, and Jack was about to lead them to their deaths. The third letter was to the Kowalski family in Adelaide. Their son Stefan had changed his name to Steve when he enlisted, afraid that his Polish heritage might cause problems. But Jack had made sure everyone knew that Steve was as Australian as any of them and twice as brave. As the night wore on, each letter became harder to write. But it was the letter to his own brother Tommy that would reveal the true weight of Jack's burden. Tommy McLeod was in a different unit stationed 2 miles down the line. At 19, he was everything Jack had been at that age. Eager, optimistic, convinced that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Jack had joined the army to protect Tommy, but now he realized he might not live to see his brother again. "Dear Tommy," he wrote, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I need you to know that everything I did here I did because I believed it was right. But I also need you to know that sometimes being right isn't enough." Jack paused, thinking about what he wanted to say next. How do you tell your little brother that the world isn't fair? That good men die for bad reasons? That sometimes the people in charge make decisions that cost lives for no good reason at all? I need you to promise me something, Tommy. When this war is over, and it will be over someday, I need you to go home. Marry that girl you've been writing to, have children, build something good. Don't let this place change you the way it's changed me. But as Jack sealed Tommy's letter, he heard footsteps approaching his dugout. What he was about to learn would force him to make the most difficult decision of his life. Lieutenant Harrison appeared in the entrance, his face pale in the candlelight. The young officer was barely 22, fresh from military college, and Jack could see the weight of command crushing him just as surely as it was crushing Jack. "Sergeant," Harrison said quietly, "I need to tell you something about tomorrow's attack." Jack looked up from his letters. "Sir?" The intelligence was wrong. We've received new reports. Hill 60 is heavily fortified, machine gun positions, artillery, at least 2 companies of Turkish infantry. Harrison's voice cracked slightly. "Command knows this. They are sending us anyway." Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why? Diversion. While we're attacking Hill 60, the main force will assault the Turkish positions at Lone Pine. Our attack is meant to draw their reserves away from the real target. Harrison sat down heavily on a wooden crate. "We're not expected to take the hill, Sergeant. We're expected to die trying." The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. But what Lieutenant Harrison said next would change everything Jack thought he knew about duty and sacrifice. "I can't do it, Sergeant," Harrison whispered. "I can't send these men to die for a diversion. I've been thinking about it all night, and I can't do it." Jack stared at the young officer. "What are you saying, sir?" I'm saying that maybe we don't follow these orders. Maybe we find another way. Maybe we refuse to be part of this madness. Harrison's hands were shaking. I know it's mutiny. I know what they'll do to us, but I can't live with sending 12 good men to their deaths for nothing. Jack looked down at the letters he'd been writing. 12 letters to 12 families who would never see their sons again. Then he looked at Lieutenant Harrison, a boy barely older than his brother Tommy, asking him to choose between duty and conscience. What Jack decided in that moment would determine not just the fate of his squad, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. Sir, Jack said slowly, I've been thinking the same thing. But I've also been thinking about something else. He gestured to the letters spread across his makeshift desk. These men didn't sign up to die for nothing, but they also didn't sign up to be cowards. Harrison looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, maybe there's a third option. Maybe we don't refuse the orders, and maybe we don't just march to our deaths either. Jack stood up, his mind racing. What if we modify the mission? What if we find a way to complete the objective without throwing away 12 lives? How? Jack moved to his map, pointing to Hill 60. The orders say to take the hill. They don't say how. What if instead of a frontal assault we do something unexpected? What if we make enough noise to draw the Turkish reserves but do it smart? What Jack proposed next would be either brilliant or suicidal, and the difference might determine whether any of them lived to see another dawn. We split into 3 groups, Jack explained. 4 men create a diversion on the eastern slope. Lots of noise, lots of movement, but from covered positions. 4 more men circle around to the north and set up a crossfire. The remaining 4, including you and me, approach from the south where they won't expect us. Harrison studied the map. It's still incredibly dangerous. Yes, sir, it is. But it gives us a chance, and more importantly, it gives the men a chance to fight back instead of just dying. Jack looked at the young lieutenant. The question is, are you willing to take responsibility for changing the plan? Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. If it means giving these men a fighting chance, yes. I'll take responsibility. Jack felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not hope that they'd all survive. He was too experienced for that kind of optimism. But hope that they might die as soldiers instead of sacrificial lambs. But as Jack prepared to brief his men on the new plan, he discovered something that would test his leadership in ways he never imagined. Private Danny Collins, the 19-year-old radio operator, had been listening outside the dugout. When Jack emerged, the boy was waiting for him, tears streaming down his face. "Sergeant," Danny said, "I heard what you and the lieutenant were talking about. About the orders being a diversion. About us being sent to die." Jack's heart sank. If Danny had heard, others might have too. Panic could spread through the squad like wildfire. "Danny, I need you to listen to me very carefully. No, Sergeant, you need to listen to me." Danny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I want you to know that it doesn't matter. Diversion or not, suicide mission or not, we're with you. All of us. We'd follow you into hell if you asked us to." Jack stared at the young man. "Danny, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly, sir. You think we don't know when we're being sent on a one-way mission? You think we can't tell the difference between a real attack and a sacrifice play?" Danny's voice grew stronger. "We know, Sergeant. We've all known since the orders came down. But we also know that if anyone can get us through this, it's you." What happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest acts of leadership happen not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments when men choose to trust each other with their lives. One by one, the other members of the squad emerged from their positions. Michael O'Brien, the teacher from Perth. Stefan Kowalski, the Polish immigrant from Adelaide. All 12 men standing in the pre-dawn darkness, looking at their sergeant with absolute trust. "We heard the new plan, Sarge," said Michael. "It's a good plan. Better than marching straight into those machine guns." "But even if it wasn't," added Stefan, "we'd still follow you. Because you're the only officer in this whole bloody war who treats us like human beings instead of ammunition." Jack looked at these men, boys really most of them, and felt the weight of their trust settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. They were asking him to lead them into battle, knowing they might not come back, trusting that he would do everything in his power to bring them home. At 4:30 a.m., as the first light began to creep over the Gallipoli Peninsula, Sergeant Jack McLeod led his squad toward Hill 60. They moved in 3 groups, just as he'd planned, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. The diversion worked perfectly. The eastern group created enough noise to draw the Turkish reserves, while the northern group established their crossfire position. Jack's southern approach caught the defenders completely off guard. For 20 minutes it looked like the impossible might happen. They actually began to take ground, pushing the Turkish defenders back from their forward positions. Jack allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, they might all make it through this. But war has its own mathematics, and courage alone isn't always enough to change the equation. The Turkish counterattack came at dawn, just as Jack's squad was consolidating their position on the lower slopes of Hill 60. Artillery shells began falling like rain, and machine gun fire swept across the hillside like a deadly wind. In the end, 5 of Jack's men made it back to the Australian lines. 7 did not. Among the dead was young Danny Collins, the radio operator who had trusted Jack enough to follow him into hell. But here's what the official reports didn't say. Those 5 survivors lived because their sergeant had refused to accept that good men should die for nothing. They lived because Jack McLeod had chosen to modify his orders, to fight smart instead of just fighting hard. And the letters Jack had written the night before, he never sent them. Instead, he wrote different letters that told the families of the fallen that their sons had died fighting, not just dying, that they had died as part of a plan that gave them a chance, not as pawns in someone else's game. Lieutenant Harrison survived the war and went on to become a teacher, spending the rest of his life telling young people about the sergeant who had shown him that true leadership sometimes means having the courage to change the plan. Jack McLeod survived too, though he carried the weight of those 7 deaths for the rest of his life. He returned to Australia, married his sweetheart Sarah, and raised 3 children. He never spoke publicly about what happened on Hill 60, but his family knew that every August 6th, he would sit alone in his study and write letters to families he'd never met, telling them about sons who had died with dignity instead of despair. The lesson of Jack McLeod's last stand isn't about the glory of war or the nobility of sacrifice. It's about the terrible burden of leadership and the courage it takes to make impossible decisions when other people's lives hang in the balance. Sometimes being a leader means following orders. Sometimes it means having the wisdom to know when those orders are wrong and the courage to find a better way. And sometimes it means accepting that even when you do everything right, good people still die, and you have to find a way to live with that knowledge. Jack McLeod understood all of this on that August night in 1915 when he sat in a dugout writing letters he hoped he'd never have to send. He understood that leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Today, nearly 110 years later, Jack McLeod's story reminds us that in the midst of humanity's darkest moments, there are always those who choose to lead with both courage and compassion, who refuse to accept that good people should die for bad reasons, who understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against the enemy, but against the systems that treat human lives as expendable. Jack McLeod was one of those leaders, and his last stand at Hill 60 proved that even in war there's always a choice between doing what you're told and doing what's right.